Liberty Nation. Truth is making a comeback.
Hi, this is Tim Donner with LNTV. President Trump has made his second selection for the U.S. Supreme Court. It's Brett Kavanaugh of the D.C. Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals. And joining us to analyze the president's selection to the High Court is LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza, who made an interesting prediction hours before the president's announcement. Scott, you predicted that Trump would pick someone who clerked for retiring Justice Anthony Kennedy, that this would be the inducement, this would have been the inducement to get Kennedy to retire, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
Well, yes, Tim, it wasn't exactly the rarest of predictions. I'm sure that others did as well, but Gorsuch was a Kennedy appointee, and Justice Gorsuch has, I think, been received very well by Trump and his allies. And we know that Donald Trump has some significant experience with Justice Kennedy's son in his capacity as a New York banker. So there's sort of an affinity and relation there. And also, I think that I certainly don't think it was some sort of quid pro quo, but I think if you're retiring or contemplating retirement, knowing that somebody you have helped to shepherd and mold as certainly a Supreme Court justice would think of their clerks, that would lead you more towards thinking of that being a more positive option rather than a negative one. So that's what motivated that prediction. And yeah, the sun shines on, the rest of the line.
Okay, Brett Kavanaugh, is he the safe choice, the consensus choice, a not terribly bold choice, as some conservatives have said, perhaps a choice designed to attract liberal Republican and moderate Democrat senators? What does Brett Kavanaugh bring to the table that the other supposed semifinalist Amy Coney Barrett didn't, or vice versa?
Well, Tim, if I turn on MSNBC, I learned that Judge Kavanaugh is akin to Adolf Hitler. I mean, he's the most radical judge possible. In fact, you wonder, how's it possible that most people have never even heard his name, given that he's such a radical and has been on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for over a decade. The truth is that you're probably right. I actually think that Judge Kavanaugh could be a choice with, if the Senate were controlled by Democrats, for instance, and you had to have a compromise sort of a nominee, he could be close to that in terms of he is a Justice Kennedy clerk. He has a libertarian-ish pedigree, which I think could appeal to some on the Democrat side of the aisle. Before he clerked for Justice Kennedy, he clerked for Judge Alex Kaczynski of the Ninth Circuit, who is perhaps one of the most libertarian members of the judiciary of all time, maybe. So I think that's probably true, but I always caution Tim that we won't know until the man actually, if he does, takes to the bench on the High Court and starts issuing decisions, and then we can look back through the lens of those past decisions made and see where the jurisprudence really is.
So Justice Kennedy has been, for the most part, a strict constructionist, except when it comes to social issues. He saved Roe versus Wade. He cast the deciding vote in favor of the right to gay marriage. Is it in social issues where Kavanaugh will make the greatest difference on this court?
Tim, I think that a strict constructionist, except in social issues, is like a spouse that's mostly faithful. They're of limited utility. So if Judge Kavanaugh is a strict constructionist, then yes, that will be a big change from Kennedy. So what you suggest is right, meaning that the votes that Kennedy would have made on many issues would be similar to Kavanaugh, but yet when it comes to perhaps gay marriage, for instance, we would see a different line, because the strict constructionists often do not see eye to eye with the left on those social issues.
Now we think back to David Souter, who was appointed by a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, Bush 41. David Souter lived with his mother in the backwoods of New Hampshire, And yet we were told that he would be a solid originalist, strict constructionist, and he wound up as a left-wing justice. He evolved leftward in his thinking, just like John Paul Stevens, who was appointed by the Republican President Gerald Ford. Is there any danger of that happening with Kavanaugh, considering that he's judged 300 cases over his dozen years in the D.C. Circuit?
According to the sort of econometrics people who plot and chart these things, the court tends to pull people towards the middle, which is to say that it pulls the more staunchly conservatives towards the middle and the more staunchly leftists towards the middle, which does make sense. It is a body where if you want to come to make a rule, it's helpful to get consensus. And it often does not have the sort of contentiousness with which the Congress operates or presidential politics, which is to say, full of venom and hostility towards the other side. They do try to be collegial. So I would suspect that would hold true for Judge Kavanaugh, and he would likely be pulled towards the middle. Now, whether that's a rapid shift and a significant one like Souter, or sort of more mild and gentle like perhaps Justice Alito or Justice Roberts, we'll have to see.
Should we be concerned that Brett Kavanaugh is a product of the D.C. establishment? He grew up here, he's lived here, he has served as a judge here, his whole life is centered inside the Beltway. Should we be concerned about that?
Supreme Court justices are part of the big D.C. machine, so that's probably a good thing rather than a bad thing.
Now, the D.C. Circuit of the Court of Appeals is considered the AAA farm team for the Supreme Court, to use a baseball analogy. We have here another pick that went through the D.C. Circuit. Why is the D.C. Circuit considered so much more prestigious than the other circuits? Because it's in the nation's capital?
Tim, that court is not important because of its geography necessarily. It's important because it has been a place where the big cases of the day are brought. And they're brought there because it's in the D.C. Circuit. And it's sort of like the most, what's the right word for it? Maybe it's the most national of the circuits in terms of the breadth of its holdings. And because of that, and because it's in proximity to D.C., it became a place where the executive would place the best and brightest of the judiciary that they were grooming for the court. So when it starts as one thing, it just sort of snowballed into becoming that thing to a higher degree. And that's one of the reasons why I think so many of us think that the nomination process will be free from much drama, because since this judge has been vetted for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and has sat on that court for over 10 years, it's unlikely that we're going to hear some sort of nanny-type stories or Gloria Allred with a press conference about a 30-year-old butt grab or something ridiculous like that. So,
yes, well, and of course, Brett Kavanaugh was easily confirmed by the Senate by over 20 votes for the D.C. Circuit. So there's going to be a bunch of Democrats who, if they vote against him this time, will have some splaining to do, but I'm sure they're ready with an answer. Last question, Scott. It was actually Harry Reid, a Democrat majority leader in the Senate for years, who made this likely confirmation, possible by introducing the so-called nuclear option on the Senate for all federal judges short of the Supreme Court. The Republicans then, when they took control, did the same for the High Court. So in many ways, this is the unintended consequence of Harry Reid doing all he could to push Barack Obama's judicial nominees through.
You could say that. You could also say it's the unintended consequence of Senator Kennedy and Senator Biden and the Democrats in the 80s who decided that Judge Bork was an unacceptable choice when Reagan put him forth. And that's, I think, a better way to think about it. They're the ones who Judge Bork was not a person who I wanted to see on the Supreme Court, but to argue that he was unqualified to sit on the court, which is what they did, or held radical positions, which is what they did. And those were lies or untruths. That, I think, is what has led us to this road now, where it will be a bare majority, and it will be, the Democrats won't have much to say about it. And I think the Republic is poor for it, Tim. It is helpful in these, these major decisions that there's some comedy given to the other side. And with that removed, I don't think it bodes well for our future necessarily.
Well, we're hardly done with this topic. Scott and I will be discussing it on the LibertyNation.com podcast, The Uprising, this week, specifically about the future and past of Roe versus Wade. And also on Liberty Nation Radio, we'll drill down deep on Brett Kavanaugh and the future of the Supreme Court. And you can read Scott's stuff on the Supreme Court and all matters legal and illegal at LibertyNation.com. I'm Tim Donner, and this is LNTV.
Subscribe and like this video. LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback.